The November wind swept through Greenwich, Connecticut, carrying with it the scent of burning maple and the distant hum of Long Island Sound. Leaves the color of aged copper scattered across the circular driveway of Harrington Manor, a Georgian revival estate that had stood sentinel over these 15 acres since 1924. The house had witnessed 3 generations of Harrington men build and lose fortunes, marry and bury wives, raise children who would either honor or disgrace the family name. Tonight, it would witness something it had never seen before. William Harrington III pulled his black Mercedes into the driveway at 7 minutes past 6, 3 hours earlier than expected. The flight from Chicago had landed ahead of schedule, and he had declined his driver's offer, choosing instead to navigate the familiar roads himself. He needed the silence. He needed the thinking time. He needed to prepare himself for another evening of polite distance and carefully measured words in a house that had once known laughter. The engine fell silent. William remained in the driver's seat, his hands still gripping the leather steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the warm glow emanating from the kitchen windows. Someone was in there. Someone was moving. And that, in itself, was unusual enough to give him pause. Catherine never entered the kitchen. Not once in their 8 years of marriage had he seen his wife so much as boil water for tea. That was what the staff was for, she always said. That was what money afforded them. The luxury of being served, the privilege of never having to perform the mundane tasks that ordinary families perform together. Cooking was beneath her. Domesticity was beneath her. And lately, it seemed that even the pretense of family was beneath her. He stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his cheeks, and walked toward the side entrance that led through the mudroom and into the kitchen. His footsteps were quiet on the flagstone path, muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves. Through the window, he could see movement. A figure in pale blue, hair swept up in a careless knot, arms working at something on the center island. His heart seized. It was Catherine. His Catherine. And she was cooking. William pressed his palm flat against the cold glass of the door, steadying himself. In 8 years, he had learned to expect nothing from this woman who had once promised him everything. He had learned to navigate her silences, to interpret her absences, to make peace with the version of marriage they had constructed together, a partnership of appearances, a union of convenience, a loveless arrangement that served their family's interests and satisfied society's expectations. He had stopped hoping for warmth. He had stopped believing in transformation. But there she was. He opened the door slowly, careful not to announce his presence. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped him immediately. The heat from the gas range, the steam rising from a large pot, the unmistakable aroma of something rich and savory. Onions, garlic, tomatoes, beef. It smelled like his grandmother's kitchen had smelled when he was a boy, back before the family had grown so wealthy that they forgot how to feed themselves. And then he heard it. A sound that stopped his heart entirely. Laughter. A child's laughter. High and bright and impossibly pure. The laughter of the boy he had brought into this house 3 years ago, the boy his wife had refused to acknowledge, the boy she had called a mistake, an embarrassment, a living reminder of his failure, the laughter of his son. William moved forward, rounding the corner of the massive sub-zero refrigerator, and the scene before him dissolved every wall he had ever built around his heart. Elliot sat on a tall wooden stool at the kitchen island, his 7-year-old face dusted with flour, his dark curls wild and untamed. He was stirring something in a large ceramic bowl, his tongue poking out in concentration, his eyes fixed on Catherine with an expression of pure adoration. And Catherine, elegant, distant, untouchable Catherine, was leaning across the island, showing him how to fold the ingredients together, her hand guiding his smaller hand, her voice soft and patient in a way William had never heard before. "Gently," she was saying. "You have to be gentle with it, or the meatballs will be tough. See? Like this. Round and round. That's perfect, Elliot. You're a natural." The boy beamed. "Mommy said I could help. She said I'm her best helper." William's knees buckled. He caught himself on the doorframe, his vision blurring, something hot and unfamiliar rising in his throat. Mommy. The boy had called her Mommy, and she had not corrected him. She had not flinched. She had smiled. Catherine looked up then, her eyes meeting his across the kitchen. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them thickened with 3 years of silence, 3 years of separate bedrooms and cold hallways, and a child who had learned to make himself invisible. 3 years of William watching his son grow up motherless in a house with a mother. 3 years of grief so deep he had stopped calling it by its name. "You're home," Catherine said softly. There was something in her voice he did not recognize, something vulnerable, something new. "I'm home," he managed. The words came out strangled, broken. Elliot spun on his stool, his face lighting up like a sunrise. "Daddy! Daddy, look! We're making Mommy's special meatballs. She said it was her grandmother's recipe. She said it's been in her family forever. She said I'm going to learn it so I can make it for my kids someday." William opened his mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. His throat had closed. His eyes burned. Everything he had believed about his marriage, his wife, his broken family, it was unraveling before him, thread by thread, assumption by assumption. He had built a fortress around his expectations, and Catherine had somehow found a way inside without his knowing. "Come," Catherine said, extending her hand toward him. "Come taste the sauce. Elliot worked very hard on it." William crossed the kitchen on legs that felt like water. He stopped beside his son, and without thinking, without planning, without any of the careful control that had defined his life, he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed. Elliot looked up at him with those dark eyes. Elena's eyes, his mother's eyes, the woman William had loved and lost before he ever met Catherine, and smiled. "Are you crying, Daddy?" William wiped his face with the back of his hand. "No," he lied. "It's the onions." Elliot nodded sagely. "Mommy cried too. She said the onions were very strong today." William looked at Catherine. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her mascara slightly smudged at the corners. She had been crying. His ice queen, his distant wife, his untouchable partner. She had been crying in this kitchen while teaching his son to cook. "Catherine!" he breathed. She shook her head once, a small movement that meant later, not now, not in front of the boy. But her hand reached out and found his, her fingers intertwining with his own, and she squeezed. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched him in 18 months. "The meatballs are almost ready," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at her lashes. "Elliot wants to eat in the breakfast nook tonight. He says the dining room is too big and too quiet." "The breakfast nook," William repeated, as if the words were foreign. "Yes, with the checkered tablecloth and candles. Elliot picked everything out himself." The boy was already scrambling down from his stool, grabbing William's free hand, tugging him toward the small alcove off the kitchen where the morning light was best. "Come on, Daddy, come see. I set the table all by myself. Mommy said I did a beautiful job." William allowed himself to be led. He allowed the warmth to seep into his bones, the impossible hope to kindle in his chest. He did not understand what had happened. He did not understand what had changed. But for the first time in 3 years, his son was calling someone mommy, and that someone was not pushing him away. The breakfast nook had been transformed. The small round table was covered with a red and white checkered cloth, something William had never seen before, something that must have been purchased specifically for this occasion. 3 place settings, 3 cloth napkins folded into triangles, 3 water glasses filled to identical levels. In the center, a small vase held a single yellow chrysanthemum, slightly wilted, clearly picked from the garden by small, eager hands. "I picked the flower," Elliot announced proudly. "Mommy said yellow means happiness. She said we're going to have a happy dinner tonight." William sank into one of the chairs, his body suddenly too heavy to support. He stared at the place setting before him, the careful arrangement of fork and knife, the napkin placed just so. And something inside him cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Like ice in spring, like armor too long worn. "Elliot," he said, his voice rough, "why don't you go wash your hands before dinner? Make sure you get all the flour off." The boy hesitated, looking between his father and Catherine. Some instinct, some childish wisdom, told him that the adults needed a moment alone. Okay, Daddy, but save me the biggest meatball. He bounded out of the room, his footsteps thundering up the back stairs, and then they were alone. William and Catherine, husband and wife, two strangers who had shared a bed and a name and a home for 8 years without ever truly knowing each other. When? William asked. It was the only word he could manage. Catherine sat down across from him, her hands folded on the tablecloth, her posture as perfect as ever. But there was something different in her eyes, something broken, something healing. 3 weeks ago, she said. You were in Tokyo. There was a thunderstorm. Elliot was frightened. Margaret had the night off, and I was the only one here. Margaret, the nanny, the woman who had raised William's son while his wife looked on from a distance, the woman who had dried Elliot's tears and soothed his nightmares and taught him that he was worthy of love even when the lady of the house could not bear to look at him. He came to your room? William asked. Catherine shook her head. He came to the library. He knew I would be there. He's always known. He's been watching me, William. For 3 years that child has been watching me, waiting for me to see him. And I... She stopped, her voice breaking. I was too cruel, too proud, too afraid. Afraid of what? Catherine's eyes met his, and in them William saw the truth she had never spoken aloud. The truth she had hidden behind coldness and distance and carefully constructed walls. Afraid of loving him, she whispered. Afraid of loving your son. Because loving him meant accepting that you had loved someone before me, that you had a life before me, that there was a woman who gave you something I could never give you, a child. And I was too small, too petty, too broken to see past my own jealousy. William's throat tightened. Elena. She was talking about Elena, the woman he had loved in his 20s, the artist who had captured his heart and his body and then left him without warning, disappearing to Italy with nothing but a note that said she was not ready for forever. He had mourned her for 2 years. He had married Catherine on the rebound, seeking stability where there had been chaos, seeking predictability where there had been passion. And then, 4 years into his marriage, Elena had died in a car accident in Tuscany, and the Italian authorities had called to inform him that he had a son. A son Elena had never told him about. A son she had raised alone, in poverty, in a small village outside of Florence. A son who had been 4 years old when his mother died, who had been sent across an ocean to live with a father he had never met, who had arrived at Harrington Manor with nothing but a small suitcase and a photograph of a woman with dark curls and darker eyes. Catherine had never forgiven him for that son. She had never forgiven him for Elena. And William had never forgiven himself for bringing a child into a home where he was not wanted. What changed? William asked. What changed 3 weeks ago? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the breakfast nook, sending a shower of leaves against the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He asked me if I was his real mommy. William closed his eyes. He could picture it perfectly. His son, small and frightened, standing in the doorway of the library during a thunderstorm, asking the question that had haunted him for 3 years. What did you tell him? I told him no. Catherine's voice cracked. I told him no. I was not his real mommy. His real mommy was in heaven. And do you know what he said to me, William? Do you know what that child said? William shook his head, unable to speak. He said, I know, but maybe you could be my other mommy, the one who lives here, the one who stays. Catherine's tears were falling freely now, streaming down her perfect cheekbones, dripping onto the checkered tablecloth. The one who stays. That's all he wanted, William. That's all he's ever wanted. Someone who stays. The door to the breakfast nook burst open, and Elliot came bounding back in, his hands still slightly damp, his face bright with anticipation. I'm back! I'm ready for meatballs! He stopped when he saw his father's face. He stopped when he saw Catherine's tears. Are you sad? He asked, his small voice uncertain. William reached out and pulled his son into his arms, lifting him onto his lap, holding him close. No, buddy. We're not sad. We're just, we're just very, very happy. Elliot considered this for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, and wriggled out of his father's grasp to take his seat at the table. Can we eat now? I'm hungry, and Mommy worked really hard on dinner. Mommy. The word hung in the air like a blessing. Catherine rose from her chair, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and disappeared into the kitchen. She returned a moment later carrying a large platter of meatballs in tomato sauce, steam rising in fragrant curls. She set it in the center of the table, and Elliot's eyes went wide. They're perfect, he exclaimed. Just like in the pictures. Just like in the pictures, Catherine agreed, her voice steady now, her composure returned. But when she looked at William, there was something new in her gaze, something soft, something hopeful, something that looked impossibly like love. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the clink of silverware and Elliot's enthusiastic chewing. William watched his wife serve his son, watched her cut his meat into small pieces, watched her dab sauce from his chin with her napkin. These were small gestures, ordinary gestures. The kind of gestures that happened in millions of homes across America every single night. But in this home, in Harrington Manor, they were extraordinary. They were unprecedented. They were the beginning of something William had stopped believing was possible. Daddy? Elliot's voice broke through his thoughts. Yes, buddy. I like it when we all eat together. Can we do this every night? William looked at Catherine. She looked back at him. And for the first time in 8 years, something passed between them that was not resentment, not resignation, not the quiet desperation of two people trapped in a life they had not chosen. It was agreement. It was hope. It was the first fragile thread of something that might, someday, become a family. Yes, William said, his voice rough with emotion. We can do this every night. Elliot grinned, sauce smeared across his cheeks, happiness radiating from every pore of his small body. Good, because Mommy said tomorrow we're making lasagna. Catherine laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound was so foreign, so unexpected, that William felt his eyes sting all over again. Lasagna, he repeated. I haven't had homemade lasagna since I was a boy. Well, Catherine said softly, it seems you have a lot of catching up to do. William reached across the table and took her hand. She did not pull away. Elliot watched them with the quiet satisfaction of a child who has finally gotten exactly what he wanted, and outside, the November wind continued to blow, carrying away the last remnants of autumn and making room for something new. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories that touch the deepest corners of your heart are what you seek, then you belong here. Subscribe now, so you never miss a moment of the journeys we share together. 3 years earlier, on a gray September morning, William Harrington had received the phone call that would fracture his marriage beyond recognition. He had been sitting in his office on the 42nd floor of the Harrington building in Manhattan, reviewing quarterly reports, when his assistant had patched through a call from the American consulate in Florence. The voice on the other end had been clinical, detached, speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering devastating news. Elena Marchetti had died in a single car accident on a winding road outside of Fiesole. She had been alone. She had died instantly. And she had left behind a 4-year-old son named Elliot, a son whose birth certificate listed William Harrington III as the father. William had sat in silence for a long time after the call ended. He had stared at the skyline of Manhattan, at the buildings he had helped finance, at the empire his family had built over 3 generations, and he had tried to understand how his life had just been completely rewritten by a woman he had not seen in 6 years. Elena. Wild, passionate, impossible Elena. She had blown into his life like a summer storm when he was 25, an artist showing her work at a gallery his mother patronized. She had been everything his world was not, chaotic and colorful and utterly indifferent to money and status and the expectations of old families. He had loved her with the reckless abandon of youth, had believed that love would be enough to bridge the chasm between their worlds. It had not been enough. One morning, he had woken to find her gone. Her clothes, her paints, her laughter, all vanished. The note she left had been brief. "I am not ready for the life you want. Please do not look for me." And because he had loved her, because he had respected her wishes even as they destroyed him, he had not looked. He had never known about the pregnancy. He had never known about the child. Elena had kept that secret for 6 years, raising their son alone in Italy, never reaching out, never asking for help, never giving William the chance to be a father. And now she was dead. And now there was a boy. And now William had to go home and tell his wife that the past he had promised her was finished had just arrived on their doorstep in the form of a child. Catherine had been in the sunroom when he found her, arranging flowers she had ordered from the florist on Greenwich Avenue. She had looked up at him with those cool blue eyes, had seen something in his face that made her hands go still, and she had waited. "There is something I need to tell you," he had said. And then he had told her everything. The call from Florence, the accident, the boy, the birth certificate with his name on it, the fact that in 2 weeks, a child he had never met would be arriving at their home, a child who was his son, a child who had just lost his mother and his world and everything he had ever known. Catherine had listened in silence. When he finished, she had not screamed. She had not cried. She had simply set down the flowers she had been holding, wiped her hands on a linen towel, and looked at him with an expression he had never seen before, something cold and hard and final. "I see," she had said. "And what do you expect me to do with this information?" "I expect you to help me," William had answered. "He's a child, Catherine. He's alone. He has no one else. He has you. He does not have me." And that had been the end of the conversation. That had been the beginning of 3 years of silence, of separate bedrooms, of a child who lived in the East Wing with his nanny while the lady of the house pretended he did not exist. William had tried in the beginning. He had tried to bridge the gap, to help Catherine see past her resentment, to make her understand that Elliot was innocent, that he had not chosen to be born, that he had not chosen to lose his mother, that he had not chosen to be sent across an ocean to live with strangers. But Catherine had refused to bend. She had refused to acknowledge the boy, refused to speak his name, refused to enter any room where he might be present. She had constructed walls so high and so thick that even William could not scale them, and eventually he had stopped trying. He had focused instead on being a father. He had learned to brush Elliot's tangled curls, to tie his shoes, to read him bedtime stories in the broken Italian he had picked up during his years of business travel. He had watched his son struggle with English, struggle with the massive house, struggle with the cold woman who looked through him as if he were made of glass. And he had watched his marriage die, slowly and quietly, in the spaces between them. Now, sitting in the breakfast nook with tomato sauce on his lips and his son's laughter in his ears, William marveled at the cruelty of hope. He had buried it so deep, had built such careful defenses against it, and yet here it was, resurrected by a thunderstorm and a child's simple question. "Maybe you could be my other mommy, the one who stays." Catherine was clearing the dishes, moving between the table and the kitchen with a quiet efficiency he had never seen in her before. Elliot was helping, carrying his own plate to the sink, chattering about the dinner they would make tomorrow, and the dinner after that, and all the dinners stretching out into a future he had suddenly decided to believe in. "Bedtime," William said finally, when the dishes were done and the kitchen was clean and there was nothing left to distract them from the conversation that was coming. Elliot protested as children do, but his eyes were already heavy with sleep and satisfaction. Catherine looked at William, a question in her gaze, and he nodded. "Go," he said. "I'll clean up here. You take him up." It was a test, and they both knew it. 3 years ago, Catherine would have refused. 3 years ago, she would have called for Margaret, would have retreated to her room, would have left William to navigate the bedtime routine alone. But tonight, Catherine held out her hand to the boy, and the boy took it. "Come on, Piccolo," she said, using the Italian endearment William had taught him. "Time for sleep." Elliot beamed. "Will you read me a story?" Catherine hesitated just for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I will read you a story." They disappeared up the stairs, and William sank into a chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he could no longer contain. He did not know what had happened. He did not know if it would last. But for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not taste like ash. Upstairs, he could hear Catherine's voice, soft and uncertain, reading words she had never read before to a child she had never allowed herself to love. And when he finally climbed the stairs an hour later, he found them both asleep in Elliot's narrow bed, the book still open on Catherine's chest, her arm wrapped around his son, as if she had been doing it all his life. William stood in the doorway and wept. The weeks that followed were tentative, fragile things, days built on small gestures and careful silences, on the gradual dismantling of walls that had stood for years. Catherine did not transform overnight. She could not. The wounds she carried were too deep, the habits of distance too ingrained. But she tried, and in her trying, William saw something he had never seen before. The woman she might have been, if life had been kinder, if love had been easier, if she had not been taught from birth that vulnerability was weakness. They ate dinner together every night now, the three of them crowded around the small table in the breakfast nook, surrounded by checkered cloth and candles, and the yellow flowers Elliot insisted on picking fresh each afternoon. Catherine learned to cook, truly cook, not just follow recipes, but understand ingredients, taste as she went, adjust and improvise and create. William watched her transform in the kitchen, watched the tension leave her shoulders as she kneaded dough or stirred sauce, watched her find something in the simple act of nourishment that all her charity galas and society functions had never provided. And Elliot blossomed like a flower finally given sunlight. The nightmares that had plagued him for 3 years grew less frequent. The stutter that emerged when he was frightened began to fade. He laughed more. He talked more. He reached for Catherine's hand without hesitation now, climbed into her lap without asking permission, called her mommy with the easy confidence of a child who has finally found solid ground. But there were still shadows. There were still moments when Catherine retreated, when the old coldness crept back into her eyes, when she looked at Elliot and saw not a child, but a reminder of everything she had lost. William learned to recognize those moments, learned to give her space without abandonment, learned to be patient with a process that could not be rushed. One evening, 3 weeks after his return from Chicago, William found Catherine alone in the library. The fire was burning low, casting long shadows across the leather-bound books that lined the walls, and she was sitting in the wingback chair by the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and sat down across from her. "Tell me," he said simply. Catherine did not look at him. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass, her profile sharp against the firelight. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were recounting events that had happened to someone else entirely. "I was pregnant once," she said. "Before we were married. Did you know that?" William felt the blood drain from his face. "No, you never told me." "I was 19. His name was David. He was a law student at Yale, charming and handsome and utterly wrong for me. My mother knew within a week. She made certain arrangements." Catherine's voice was flat, emotionless, reciting facts like a newsreader. "I never saw David again. I never spoke of it again. And I convinced myself over the years that it had not mattered, that it was simply a problem that had been solved." William set down his glass. His hands were trembling. "Catherine, when you brought Elliot home," she continued, as if he had not spoken, "when you brought this living, breathing proof that you had created life with another woman, I could not bear it. Not because of Elena, not because of jealousy, but because every time I looked at that boy, I saw the child I had given up, the child I had allowed my mother to take from me, the child I had never had the courage to fight for." Tears were streaming down her face now, silent and unchecked. She made no move to wipe them away. "I hated him because he existed," she whispered. "I hated him because he was alive and my child was not." I hated him because he reminded me every single day of the choice I made when I was too young and too frightened and too weak to make any other choice, and I hated myself for hating him, which only made everything worse. William crossed the space between them and knelt before her chair. He took her hands in his, feeling the cold of her fingers, the tremor that ran through her like an electric current. "Why didn't you tell me?" Catherine finally looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the full weight of the secret she had carried for 20 years, the grief, the guilt, the self-loathing that had calcified into coldness. "Because I was ashamed," she said. "Because I thought if you knew what I had done, you would see me the way I see myself, as someone who abandons children, as someone who is not fit to be a mother, as someone who does not deserve the family you were offering me." William lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them. "You were a child yourself," he said. 19 years old, alone, afraid. You did what you had to do to survive. I abandoned my baby. Your mother abandoned your baby. You were barely more than a baby yourself." Catherine shook her head, but William would not let her retreat. He held her hands tighter, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Listen to me," he said. "What happened when you were 19 was not your fault. It was not your choice. You were a victim of circumstances and expectations, and a mother who cared more about reputation than her own daughter's well-being. But you are not 19 anymore. You are not powerless anymore. And there is a child upstairs who needs you. A child who chose you, Catherine. A child who looked at you and saw not a woman who abandons but a woman who stays." Catherine's composure finally broke. She collapsed forward, her head falling against William's shoulder, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. He held her as she cried, held her as 20 years of grief and guilt and shame poured out of her, held her as she finally allowed herself to feel what she had spent 2 decades trying to bury. When the storm had passed, when her breathing had steadied and her tears had slowed, she pulled back and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "I don't know if I can be what he needs." "You're already doing it," William said. "Every dinner you cook, every story you read, every time you hold his hand, you're already doing it. You don't have to be perfect, Catherine. You just have to be present. You just have to stay." Catherine was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. "I want to try," she whispered. "I want to try to be his mother. His real mother. Not just the woman who lives here, but the woman who loves him." William pulled her close again, and this time, when he held her, it was not to comfort, but to celebrate. Something had shifted between them. Something had opened. The walls were not gone. They would take years to dismantle completely. But a door had appeared where before there had been only stone. "Then try," he said. "That's all any of us can do." If this moment touched your heart, if you felt the weight of Catherine's confession and the hope of healing, leave a comment below saying, "Everyone deserves a second chance to love." Let your words become part of this story. December arrived with a blanket of snow that transformed Greenwich into a winter postcard. The trees along the driveway stood bare and patient, their branches encased in ice, and the sound had taken on the gray steel color of the season. Inside Harrington Manor, something remarkable was happening. Something that the staff noticed first, in whispered conversations and exchanged glances. The house was warm again. Not just physically, though the fires burned constantly now in every room, but warm in the way houses become warm when they are inhabited by people who want to be there, who seek each other out instead of avoiding, who fill the silence with conversation instead of the careful choreography of distance. Margaret, the nanny who had cared for Elliot since his arrival, watched these changes with quiet wonder. She had been preparing to give her notice. 3 years of watching a child be ignored by his stepmother had worn her patience thin, and she had already begun looking for positions in households that might appreciate her efforts. But now, something was different. Now, Mrs. Harrington came to the nursery each morning to help Elliot dress. Now, Mrs. Harrington read the bedtime stories that Margaret had once read alone. Now, Mrs. Harrington was learning to be a mother, and Margaret found herself becoming, Instead of a replacement, a guide. She asks me questions, Margaret told the cook one afternoon, her voice low with amazement. She asks me what foods he likes, what songs help him sleep, what to do when he has a nightmare. She takes notes, Mrs. Patterson. She writes it all down in a little book. The cook, a woman who had served the Harrington family for 20 years, simply shook her head. Miracles, she said. That's what they are. Plain miracles. But miracles, as William knew, were fragile things. They required protection. They required vigilance. And they required, above all, the courage to face the tests that would inevitably come. The test arrived on the second Saturday of December, in the form of Eleanor Harrington, William's mother. Eleanor had not visited the manor in 18 months. She had made her feelings about Elliot abundantly clear from the moment the boy arrived. He was a scandal, a stain on the family name, a living reminder of her son's youthful indiscretions. She had suggested, more than once, that the child would be better off in boarding school, preferably in Europe, preferably far from any society that mattered. William had refused. He had refused so firmly and so finally that Eleanor had stopped speaking to him for 6 months. Their relationship had thawed eventually, as relationships between mothers and sons always do, but the subject of Elliot had become forbidden territory. Eleanor pretended the boy did not exist, and William pretended not to notice. But now, with Christmas approaching and the society pages buzzing about the Harrington family's annual charity gala, Eleanor had decided that a visit was in order. She had called 3 days prior, announcing her arrival in the clipped tones of a woman who was not accustomed to being refused. "I'll be there Saturday," she had said. "We need to discuss the gala. And I want to see how Catherine is managing." Managing. As if Catherine were a housekeeper whose performance required review. William had not told Catherine about the call. He had not told her because he was afraid that the fragile peace they had built would shatter at the first sign of opposition, afraid that his mother's coldness would remind Catherine of her own, afraid that Eleanor would look at Elliot the way she always looked at him and undo everything. But secrets, William knew, were corrosive things. And so, on Friday night, with Elliot asleep upstairs and the fire burning low, he told his wife the truth. Catherine listened in silence. When he finished, she did not speak for a long moment. Then slowly, she rose from her chair and walked to the window, her arms crossed over her chest, her reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. "She hates him," Catherine said. It was not a question. "She doesn't know him," William replied. "She has never allowed herself to know him." "And you think that will change? You think she'll see him the way we see him now?" William sighed. "I don't know. But I know that hiding him from her isn't the answer. I've been hiding him for 3 years. All it's done is make everything worse." Catherine turned to face him. In the firelight, her features were sharp, determined, the face of a woman preparing for battle. "Then we don't hide him," she said. "We introduce him. We show her what he is. A child. A beautiful, brilliant, loving child who deserves to be part of this family. And if she cannot see that, if she cannot find it in her heart to accept him, then—" She paused, her jaw tightening. "Then she will have to accept that she is no longer welcome in our home." William stared at her. This was not the Catherine he had married. This was not the woman who had spent 8 years deferring to his mother, who had hosted Eleanor's parties and attended her functions and swallowed her criticisms with a smile that never reached her eyes. This was someone new, someone fierce, someone who had found something worth fighting for. "You would do that?" he asked. "You would stand against my mother for Elliot?" Catherine crossed the room and took his hands in hers. Her grip was strong, certain. "I would stand against anyone for Elliot," she said. "He is my son now, not by blood, but by choice. And I will not allow anyone, not your mother, not society, not the whole world, to make him feel unwanted again." William pulled her close, his heart so full he could barely breathe. "I love you," he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue. He had not spoken them in years. But they felt true. They felt necessary. Catherine was still for a moment. Then, softly, she answered, "I love you too." It was the first time she had ever said it. In 8 years of marriage, through ceremony and reception and countless nights in the same bed, she had never once spoken those words. William had stopped expecting them. He had stopped needing them. But hearing them now, in this moment, in this room, after everything they had survived, it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Eleanor Harrington arrived at precisely 11 o'clock on Saturday morning, her Blacktown car crunching up the gravel driveway with all the ceremony of a royal procession. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had never in her life been told no. Her silver hair was swept into a perfect chignon. Her pearls lay exactly parallel to her collarbone, and her eyes, the same gray-green as William's, missed nothing. William met her at the door. He kissed her cheek, took her coat, led her into the formal living room where a fire was burning and tea was already laid out. Eleanor surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a general assessing a battlefield. "Where is Catherine?" she asked. "She'll be down shortly. She's upstairs with Elliot." Eleanor's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly at the name. "I see." "Mother." William's voice was gentle but firm. "Things have changed since we last spoke. I need you to understand that before Catherine comes down." "Changed how?" "Catherine and Elliot have become close. She has taken on the role of his mother. They are a family now. We are a family." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. She sipped her tea, set the cup down with careful precision, and looked at her son with an expression he could not quite read. "You're telling me that Catherine Whitmore, who could not bear to be in the same room with that child for 3 years, has suddenly discovered maternal instincts?" "I'm telling you that she has grown," William said. "We both have." "Growth." Eleanor pronounced the word as if it were slightly distasteful. "And what, pray tell, prompted this sudden growth?" Before William could answer, footsteps sounded on the stairs. He turned to see Catherine descending, her hand clasped firmly around Elliot's smaller one. She was wearing a simple blue dress, her hair down around her shoulders, her face free of the heavy makeup she usually wore for Eleanor's visits. She looked softer than William had ever seen her. She looked like a mother. Elliot was dressed in his best clothes, a white button-down shirt and navy trousers that Catherine had helped him pick out that morning. His dark curls had been combed into temporary submission, and his eyes were wide with the nervous excitement of a child meeting someone important. "Eleanor," Catherine said, crossing the room with Elliot still in tow. "How lovely to see you." Eleanor rose from her chair, her eyes moving between Catherine and the boy with an unreadable expression. "Catherine, you look different." "Thank you. I feel different." Catherine stopped in front of her mother-in-law, and her grip on Elliot's hand tightened slightly. "I don't believe you've ever been properly introduced to Elliot. Eleanor, this is our son. Elliot, this is your grandmother." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Grandmother. Eleanor's nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. Elliot, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults, stepped forward with the fearless confidence of childhood. He extended his hand exactly as Catherine had taught him. "It's very nice to meet you, grandmother," he said, his accent still carrying faint traces of Italian. "Mommy told me you like tea parties. I like tea parties too. Maybe we can have one together sometime." For a long moment, Eleanor did not move. She stared down at the boy, at his dark eyes, his olive skin, his features that were so clearly not Harrington, not Whitmore, not anything from the world she had so carefully constructed. She stared at his extended hand, small and trusting and utterly without guile. And then something extraordinary happened. Eleanor Harrington, matriarch of one of Connecticut's oldest families, arbiter of society, and guardian of reputation, knelt down until she was eye level with her grandson. She took his small hand in her wrinkled one, and she smiled. "Tea parties," she said, her voice softer than William had heard it in years. "Yes, I do like tea parties. Perhaps you could show me your favorite tea set after lunch. Elliot's face lit up like a Christmas tree. Really? You want to see my tea set? It has bears on it. Mommy bought it for me last week. Bears, Eleanor repeated. How delightful. William felt Catherine's hand slip into his. He squeezed it tightly, not trusting himself to speak. This was not the confrontation he had prepared for. This was not the battle Catherine had steeled herself to fight. This was something else entirely. Something unexpected. Something hopeful. Something that looked remarkably like grace. Lunch was served in the formal dining room, but there was nothing formal about it. Elliot chattered throughout the meal, telling Eleanor about his school and his friends and the cooking lessons with Mommy and the book they were reading about a rabbit who went on adventures. Eleanor listened with an attention that surprised everyone, asking questions, laughing at his jokes, praising his excellent table manners. Afterward, true to her word, she accompanied him upstairs to see the famous bear tea set. They were gone for over an hour. When they finally returned to the living room, Elliot was carrying a small silver brooch in his hand, a family heirloom that Eleanor had worn to every important event for 40 years. Grandmother said I could give this to Mommy, Elliot announced proudly. She said it's a present. She said it means Mommy is really, truly part of the family now. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Eleanor, who stood in the doorway with an expression that was almost tender. Thank you, Catherine whispered. Eleanor nodded once, a small movement that contained volumes. I was wrong, she said simply. I have been wrong for 3 years. That child is... She paused, searching for words. That child is remarkable. And you, Catherine, what you have done, what you have become. I did not think it was possible. It almost wasn't, Catherine admitted. I almost lost him. I almost lost all of this. But you didn't. Eleanor crossed the room and, in a gesture that shocked everyone including herself, embraced her daughter-in-law. You didn't lose him. You found him. And in finding him, you found yourself. William watched his mother hold his wife, watched his son clutch the silver brooch like a treasure, watched his family knit itself together in ways he had never imagined possible. The walls were coming down. The coldness was thawing, and somewhere in a small village in Italy, he liked to think that Elena was watching her son finally find the home she had never been able to give him. Spring came early to Greenwich that year, as if nature itself had decided to celebrate the transformation that had taken place within the walls of Harrington Manor. The snow melted by mid-March, giving way to crocuses and daffodils that pushed through the softening earth with determined optimism. The trees along the driveway began to bud, their bare branches slowly clothing themselves in green, and the sound sparkled under skies that grew bluer with each passing day. Inside the manor, the changes were equally profound. The formal dining room, unused for months, had been converted into an art studio where Elliot spent his afternoons painting. Catherine had discovered his talent by accident, a drawing he had made of her in the kitchen, stirring sauce, her hair escaping its knot, and had immediately arranged for supplies, for lessons, for a space where he could create without constraint. The boy had his mother's gift, it seemed. Elena's legacy lived on in the sure strokes of his brush, the bold colors he chose, the way he saw beauty in ordinary things. William had reduced his travel schedule by half. The business could survive without him for a few days each week, and what it could not survive was less important than what he would lose if he continued to choose work over family. He was present now, truly present, for breakfast and dinner and the small moments in between. He learned to cook alongside Catherine and Elliot, producing meals that were sometimes edible and sometimes disastrous, and always accompanied by laughter. Catherine had begun volunteering at a local shelter for women and children escaping domestic situations. She did not speak of it often, but William knew why she had chosen this particular cause. She was giving others what she herself had never received, a second chance, a safe harbor, the knowledge that the choices of the past did not have to define the possibilities of the future. And Eleanor, stern, formidable Eleanor, had become Elliot's most devoted champion. She attended every school play, every art show, every soccer game his small legs carried him through. She had framed his bare tea-set drawing in silver and hung it in her living room, directly above the fireplace where the family portraits had always lived. When questioned by her society friends, she simply smiled and said, "My grandson is an artist. Talent skips generations, you know." On a warm evening in late May, the family gathered in the garden for dinner. The table had been set beneath the old oak tree, candles flickering in glass holders, the scent of wisteria heavy in the air. Elliot was telling a complicated story about a frog he had found near the pond, his hands gesturing wildly, his dark eyes bright with the joy of an audience that hung on his every word. Catherine watched him with a softness that still surprised William when he caught it unawares. She had changed so completely, so thoroughly, that it was sometimes difficult to remember the woman she had been. The ice had melted. The walls had fallen. In their place stood someone who laughed easily, who loved fiercely, who had discovered that vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. When dinner was finished and Elliot had been carried to bed, protesting all the way as was his custom, William and Catherine remained in the garden. The candles had burned low. The stars had emerged, scattered across the Connecticut sky like diamonds on velvet. "I've been thinking," Catherine said softly. William turned to look at her. In the candlelight, she was luminous, not with the cold perfection she had once cultivated, but with something warmer, something real. About what? She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. About having another child. William's breath caught. In 8 years of marriage, they had never discussed children. It had been an unspoken understanding. Catherine did not want them, and William had not pushed. After Elliot arrived, the subject had become even more forbidden, wrapped in layers of resentment and grief. But now, here, in this garden where everything had changed, Catherine was opening a door he had long ago locked shut. "Are you certain?" he asked carefully. Catherine looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not certainty but courage, the willingness to try, to risk, to hope for something she had once believed herself unworthy of. "No," she admitted. "I'm not certain. I'm terrified, actually, but I've learned something this year, William. I've learned that the things that terrify us most are often the things most worth doing, and I've learned that I am capable of more than I ever believed." She paused, her hand finding his across the table. "I want to give Elliot a sibling. I want to give us a family that we build together from the beginning. I want to stop being afraid of love." William lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. His throat was too tight for words, but words were not necessary. Not anymore. They had spent 8 years speaking without saying anything. Now finally they had learned to communicate in the language that mattered. The language of presence, of choice, of showing up day after day and choosing each other. "Then we'll try," he said simply. "Together." Catherine smiled, a real smile, unguarded and full of light, and leaned across the table to kiss him. It was a soft kiss, tender and unhurried, the kiss of two people who had finally found their way home. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance. In the house, Elliot slept peacefully, dreaming of frogs and paintings and the mother who stayed. And in the garden, two people who had once been strangers began, at last, to fall in love. 1 year later, on a golden September morning, Catherine gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elena, for the woman who had given William his first child, for the artist whose spirit lived on in Elliot's paintings, for the mother who had loved her son enough to let him go. Elliot held his baby sister for the first time with the careful reverence of an 8-year-old entrusted with something precious. He looked up at Catherine, his dark eyes shining. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She looks like you, Mommy." Catherine smiled through her tears. "She looks like all of us," she said. "She looks like family." And so the house that had known such coldness filled at last with warmth. The manor that had witnessed generations of duty and distance learned finally what it meant to be a home. And the family that had been fractured by secrets and silence discovered that the cracks were not weaknesses but openings, places where light could enter, where love could grow, where second chances could take root and flourish. This is not an ending. It is a beginning. It is the first page of a story that will continue to be written in bedtime stories and family dinners, in scraped knees and first steps, in the ordinary miracles of daily life. And if you watched this far, it's because this story touched your heart. It's because you believe, as I do, that redemption is possible, that families can be rebuilt, that love, in all its forms, is worth fighting for. Leave a comment below saying, "I watched this far, so I can know who you are, so I can know who truly cherishes these stories." Your presence here matters. Your engagement matters. You are part of this community of hearts that gathers around candlelight and shared emotion. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. And until next time, remember, it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. It's never too late to love the ones who need you. It's never too late to stay.